What up, guys? Welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm just playing. What up, Braden? I'm just kidding. We're going over Chapter 3, the end of Chapter 3, going over action systems today. So, yeah, let's dive into it. So, action systems. The action systems include areas of the nervous system, such as the motor cortex, brainstem, cerebellum, and basal ganglia, which perform processing essential to coordination of movement. Think about when I'm trying to get y'all with the upside down OK sign. My sensory structures help me to map where my body is in space and help me to locate where I need to put my hand in order for it to count, which in this example is below the waist. I also need to make fine motor movements with my fingers to make the action of opposition with my thumb and index finger. Now I need to generate those movements. I plan to move into that position. My brain identifies the specific muscles needed for my intended action and helps to modify and refine the movement to achieve that action. I do the action and then boom, y'all look. I get the satisfaction of making y'all look, and this is what kind of the action system of our body does. So moving on deeper into the first part of the action system is the motor cortex. The motor cortex is situated in the frontal lobe and is made up of the primary motor cortex and two premotor, oh my gosh, I always want to say mortal or something like that, premotor cortical areas, including the supplementary motor area, you'll see me refer to it as the SMA, and the premotor cortex area. These areas interact with sensory processing areas in the parietal lobe, also with the basal ganglia and cerebral areas to identify where we want to move, to plan the movement, and to execute those actions. Again, as always, sorry for my slur. You'd think I'd have it better on a video, but I don't. But yeah, so yeah, figure one over here on the left hand side is the motor cortex. As you can kind of see, hopefully you can see my mouse on this, there's the central sulcus. Just anterior to the central sulcus is the primary motor cortex, and then anterior to that is the SMA and the premotor cortex. So that kind of gives you an idea where they are anatomically. And then over to the figure on the right is the motor homunculus, which is kind of like the primary motor cortex, and it tells you what parts of that area is activating which parts of your body. So up here, obviously, you see the toes, the ankle, the knee, the hand over here, the face, and then the throat. So yeah, so we're gonna move it on to our next dude. Rock on. Thank you for your time, other Brandon. Here's Brandon 2.0. So yeah, we're gonna dive in even deeper into the motor cortex. So we're going to go over the primary motor cortex, which also encases the corticospinal tract, as it heavily contributes to the corticospinal tract. So yeah, each area of the motor cortex has their own somatotopic map of the body, but the primary motor cortex is a very complex map of the body and contributes to the corticospinal tract. The corticospinal tract, shown in the figure to the right, includes neurons from the primary motor cortex and premotor areas, including supplementary motor cortex, dorsal and ventral premotor cortex, and the somatosensory cortex. The fibers descend ipsilaterally from the cortex through the internal capsule, midbrain, and the medulla. In the medulla, the fibers concentrate to form pyramids, quote unquote, and near the junction of the medulla and the spinal cord, roughly 90% of the fibers cross to form the lateral corticospinal tract, controlling precise movements of the distal muscles of the limbs. The remaining 10% continue uncrossed to form the anterior or ventral corticospinal tract, controlling less precise movements of the proximal muscles of the limbs and trunk. So yeah, you can kind of see that in the figure to the right. Yeah, I don't really need to go. Hopefully you guys can see it. If not, we will make this presentation or video, I guess, open to you guys. So yeah, so going over some of the primary function of the primary motor cortex include the ability to generate force used to move a limb and the rate of change of force. It's also important to note that there are many neurons. According to a study, only specific movements activated certain neurons maximally, yet each neuron responded for a wide array of movements. So it's crazy to think how movements are so finely controlled when neurons are so broadly tuned. In a therapy situation, it is important to understand because it implies that there are many parallel motor pathways for carrying out an action sequence. Thus, training a patient to utilize a specific set of muscles to do an action in one instance does not automatically mean that the training will transfer to other activities requiring the same set of muscles. For an example, like if you were teaching a patient to grasp a soda can, lift it up and shake it around like, hey, cool, that's one action, and it's using specific muscles, as we know. But let's say the same action of clenching your fist and getting mad and shaking it, even though that kind of looks similar, it might not be the same neurons activated. So it's very, very necessary to train patients with, I guess, similar but not exact actions, just to know. So yeah, we're gonna have, well, what's up, Braden? We're gonna have the next Brandon take it over down below. All right, forget Braden. What's up, Chandler? I'm just kidding. Next up, we got the Supreme Brandon, Spider Brand. Oh yeah, that's right. But yeah, we're going to go over the supplementary motor area and the premotor cortex. Both of these areas send projections to the primary cortex and the spinal cord, but movements that are initiated internally are controlled primarily by the SMA. This area also contributes to activating motor programs involved in learned sequences. For example, the simple task of squishing a spring between your thumb and index finger activated areas in the primary motor cortex, and touching all 4 fingers in different orders showed an increase in SMA activation as well as the primary cortex. But just by rehearsing that same movement in your head without actually doing it only showed activation in the SMA. And in all, it was concluded that the SMA is active when a sequence of simple ballistic movements are planned but not necessarily done. Movements that are activated by external stimuli are controlled primarily by the lateral premotor area. Think of the visual cue to go when a traffic light turns from red to green. This area controls how stimuli are to be used to direct the action, specifically associating a given sensory event with the movement to be made, aka associative learning. So yeah, the SMA and premotor cortex differ in their activity depending on how the movement is initiated and guided. Also, the premotor cortex receives input from the cerebellum, while the SMA receives input from the putamen of the basal ganglia. Hence why some with Parkinson's, with their decreased output of dopamine, the putamen, struggle with initiating walking as their SMA and nearby motor cortex areas are impaired. So yeah, moving on, one more Brandon to go until the smart one Samantha talks. Shaban. What's up, dude? What up, dudes and dudettes? This is gonna be sick. I'm just kidding. On a serious note, we're gonna go over higher level association areas. So the association areas of the frontal regions are important for motor planning and other cognitive behaviors. They've been hypothesized to integrate sensory information and then select appropriate motor responses from many possible responses. So yeah, now we're going to go over attentional networks. 3 attentional networks, that's how they're divided, including alerting, which comes from the bilateral thalamus, orientation, which comes from the right pulvinar and temporoparietal regions, and conflict resolution or executive attention, which comes from the anterior cingulate cortex or the frontal parietal cortex. There's also a second framework for characterizing attention, the first being the dorsal frontoparietal network that controls spatial attention and eye movements, and the second being the ventral frontoparietal network involved in non-spatial behaviors such as arousal, reorienting or shifting attention, and detection of unexpected or novel events. These frameworks are of fundamental importance in our ability to perceive sensory stimuli. Someone with a lesion in these areas will have associated perceptual impairments and spatial neglect. But that's all from Brandog over here, so now we're going to move on over to Samantha. Rock on!
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is considered to be one of the 3 important areas of the brain that contribute to coordination, along with the motor cortex and the basal ganglia. So the cerebellum acts as a comparator that compensates for errors by comparing the intention of our movements with the actual performance. The main functions of the cerebellum include balance and equilibrium, muscle tone, coordination, and motor learning. And research has also suggested that the cerebellum may have important non-motor functions as well, including cognition. For the anatomy of the cerebellum, we have first the outer layer of gray matter, which is the cortex, and there's also an internal white matter, which are the input and output fibers, and 3 pairs of deep nuclei: the fastigial nucleus, the inner post nucleus, and the dentate nucleus. So if you look at that picture on the top left, you can see those nuclei. In the middle is the fastigial nucleus. Beside it, the globose and the emboliform nuclei together are the inner post nucleus. And then on the outside, you have the dentate nucleus. So all the inputs to the cerebellum first go to one of these 3 deep cerebellar nuclei and then onto the cortex. All outputs of the cerebellum go back to the deep nuclei before they go to the cerebral cortex or to the brainstem. The cerebellum can also be divided into 3 phylogenetic zones: the flocculonodular lobe, vermis and intermediate hemispheres, and the lateral hemispheres. So in that bottom picture, you can see those. That black structure at the bottom is the flocculonodular lobe. The yellow, and on the sides of that yellow area, inside of the dotted lines, would be the vermis and intermediate hemispheres, and on the outside are the lateral hemispheres. So the flocculonodular lobe is also known as the vestibulocerebellum, and like the name suggests, it's involved in controlling balance as well as the ocular reflexes. So this area functions in the control of the axial muscles, which are used in that balance and equilibrium control. And it's also an important part in regulating eye movement, particularly fixation on a target through the vestibulo-ocular reflex. Inputs in this area are from the visual, somatosensory, and vestibular systems, and the outputs return to the vestibular nuclei. So this makes sense with this function. You get that visual, somatosensory, and vestibular information that comes in and kind of tells the cerebellum what's going on, and then you have those outputs that help to control that balance in the ocular reflexes. So if there is a dysfunction in this system, you would observe ataxic gait, wide-based stance, and nystagmus. The vermis and intermediate hemispheres are also known as the spinocerebellum. So this part is involved in regulating body movements by allowing for error correction, and it also receives proprioceptive information. So this is sort of like what I was talking about before with the cerebellum being a comparator. It takes the information that it gets, the motor plan from the cerebral cortex. It compares that information to that proprioceptive information and other sensory information that it gets, and it sends an output back out to the cerebrum to correct any deviations in the movement. And then it also helps to modulate muscle tone through the continuous output of excitatory activity from the vestigial and interposed nuclei. So these nuclei modulate the activity of the gamma motor neurons to the muscle spindles in order to modulate that muscle tone. This area receives proprioceptive and cutaneous inputs from the spinal cord via the spinocerebellar tracts, as well as visual, vestibular, and auditory information. So there are 4 spinocerebellar tracts that relay information from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. We have 2 that relay information from the arms and the neck, and 2 that relay information from the trunks and the legs. And then there are also inputs from the spino-olivocerebellar tract, which go through the inferior olivary nucleus. Inputs to this part of the cerebellum go to those deep nuclei, specifically the vestigial nucleus, which is in the vermis, and the interposed nucleus, which is in the intermediate lobes. Outputs go to the reticular formation, vestibular nuclei, thalamus and motor cortex, and the red nucleus in the midbrain. And these outputs are involved in feed-forward mechanisms that regulate movement. The lateral hemispheres are also known as the cerebrocerebellum, and this area is involved in the planning and timing of movements, as well as the evaluation of sensory information for action as a part of the motor learning process. And the area also regulates the coordination of muscle activation and is important in visually guided movements. So this is a little bit different from the vermis and intermediate hemispheres. The vermis and intermediate hemispheres were specifically with the actual movement that's happening, and the lateral hemispheres are more that planning and timing of movements before you've even done them. So this area receives inputs from the pontine nuclei in the brainstem, which relay information from wide areas of the cerebral cortex, places like the sensory, motor, premotor areas, and that gives the lateral hemispheres that motor plan that the cerebrum comes up with. And then you also have that sensory information as well that comes in and tells you what it's like right now, like where your body is in space, so that the cerebellum can plan out the movement and can make certain predictions. And then outputs are to the thalamus and then to the motor, premotor, parietal, and prefrontal cortex. And that's where it's telling the cerebrum, this is what we should do for the planning of the movement. So lesions in this area can disrupt the timing of movements, specifically so that joints are moved sequentially rather than simultaneously. So if you think about reaching out to grasp an object, a lot of the things that happen in that motion happen simultaneously. But if you have a lesion in the lateral hemisphere, each different portion of that movement would be broken down and done sequentially. So you would reach out your arm, then you would open up your hand, close your hand around the object, and then pull it back. Each one of those would happen one after another rather than all at the same time. And this deficit is referred to as decomposition of movement. This picture is sort of just everything put together. So you can see in the top left corner there's the motor cortex, and that blue tract that's coming down and going to the muscles, that is what the motor cortex is telling the muscles to do. And then that green tract that's next to it, that's going to the cerebellum, is the copy of the motor plan. So the motor cortex telling the cerebellum, this is what I intend to do. And then you have also that proprioceptive information from the muscles, you can see in that purple track, that goes to the cerebellum. That is telling it about where the body is in space, what's going on. So it can compare that information to the intended plan and send out an output. And you can see that output in the yellow tracks there. Specifically, it goes to the thalamus, and then the thalamus relays that information to the motor cortex to make any corrections that are necessary. The cerebellum is also involved in non-motor tasks in addition to its role in motor control processes, specifically in cognition. So here are just a few of the experiments that the book lays out, some that I thought were particularly interesting. So experiments have shown that there's a connection between the dentate nucleus and the frontal association areas, which are involved in higher level cognitive processing. And this connection implies that we don't have to make a movement to activate the cerebellum. And going along with this, research was done that measured the cerebral blood flow, and it showed that there's an increase in cerebellar activity when subjects are asked only to imagine making a movement. So again, we don't actually have to make that movement to activate the cerebellum. Additionally, studies have shown that the right lateral cerebellum becomes active when subjects read verbs aloud, but not when they read nouns. So this implies that cognitive processing of verb generation requires the cerebellum, but the same processing of other words, like nouns, doesn't include the cerebellum at all. Also, there's been research done on learning problems in patients with cerebellar lesions that showed that while they had normal scores on the Wechsler memory scale, they did have problems with some types of learned responses. So in particular, there were problems that were found with recalling habits, which are those automatic responses learned through repetition. So why is all of this important? Dysfunction of the cerebellum can produce a wide range of symptoms and signs that you would see in the clinic. So the clinical picture depends on the area of the cerebellum that was affected. So if you have damage to the flocculonodular lobe, you would have that loss of equilibrium, which could cause an altered gait. In the lateral zone, if you have damage, you might have problems with skilled voluntary and planned movements, which could lead to errors in intended movements. So this is like the inability to perform rapid alternating movements. So if you were trying to rapidly pronate and supinate your arm, you might have trouble with that. And then damage to the midline portion would cause disruption of whole body movements, while damage to the upper part of the cerebellum could cause gait impairments and other problems with leg coordination like ataxia. And then I included some review information as well. There's a YouTube video. It's kind of long, but if you start at 3:28, it's very helpful in reviewing all of this stuff. It sort of gives a more complete picture of the cerebellum. There is some information that is extra that wasn't in the book, but I feel like it gives you that more complete picture, helps with understanding. And then also the Physiopedia page on the cerebellum is helpful as well.